Welcome to Wilder. Today, I'm honored to be joined here by Liron Gertsman, who first popped on my radar just a few weeks ago with this absolutely incredible image of the total solar eclipse that occurred on April 8th of this year. Without a doubt, this is by far one of the most impressive images I have ever seen. It's an honor to get to have you on here today. Can you walk me through those few minutes under the eclipse that you had and how you captured that photo in those few minutes with what was going on in the scene around you?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. They were definitely an intense few minutes because obviously I had been planning this for a long time, like over a year. So when that moment finally arrives and the shadow of the moon is cast onto the earth, you have to have everything ready to go. But to be honest, because there had been so much kind of planning and preparation, and I felt pretty good about it. I wasn't overly nervous in the moment. We had the boat in the right position. The birds were doing exactly what I had hoped they would be doing from all of that planning and research. So I was pretty calm. I was trying to also just be in the moment and enjoy the moment. And obviously things worked out pretty well. The sky filled with these magnificent frigate birds returning to their roost off the coast of Mazatlan, Mexico. And I was able to get the shot of my dreams of the frigate bird in front of that total solar eclipse.
Yeah, that was an incredible image. I love planning wildlife photography shots, it makes it just so much easier often to execute it than when you're kind of going out and just hoping on a lot of variables that, may or may not line up. I am kind of curious with in regards to it being a totality, because I can't imagine there's a ton of data on how birds, or specifically maybe frigate birds, for example, would react in a totality.
Yeah.
Were you able to get insight on that, or was that one factor that you were just hoping, like, hopefully they're around flying, or how was that for you?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's an area that the research is lacking because, total solar eclipses only occur every 1, 2, 3 years. So there's not a ton of data on what birds do during eclipses. And it probably, you're right, would completely change for different birds. But in the entire planning process of this, one of the reasons I specifically ended up where I did on the coast of Sinaloa, Mexico, was because of the presence of seabirds. And seabirds, I think, have a little bit more kind of reliability in their behaviors between day and night. So kind of the plan was to find a spot where there would be a lot of seabirds, hopefully frigate birds. That was always the dream because they have that incredible silhouette. Yeah. So the plan was to find a spot where there are a lot of frigate birds, both during the daytime and also during the night. Because during an eclipse, it's reasonable to believe that birds will act like it's nighttime and they might go to a roost or do some kind of behavior that they would normally do when it's getting dark. But also because it's such a brief time, right? 4 minutes and 20 seconds in this case, which is relatively long for a total solar eclipse. But because it's such a brief period of time, there is also a chance that they might not head to their roost and they might just kind of act like it's daytime and change up their behavior a bit. So I think the thing that was really, really important for making this a successful shoot was finding a spot where there would be birds both during the day and during the night. And the islands that we settled on off the coast of Mazatlan, the Piedras Blancas, were a spot that we had been observing night after night, and we noticed that every single night there would be hundreds of frigate birds and other seabirds that would go and land and roost on those islands, but also during the daytime there'd be several dozen frigate birds just soaring around the islands as well. So it seemed like it was going to be a pretty good chance that during an eclipse, kind of regardless of what the birds did, that there would be some birds around in that area.
Yeah, that's really smart, making sure that both at daytime and nighttime you've observed those birds being accessible and flying around in that area to get that shot. Yeah. That's good. And yeah, you're totally right. Those frigate bird silhouettes, oh man, they are incredible to look at. So that was a great choice of subject there.
Thank you. Yeah, they're pterodactyl-esque. They're the closest silhouette, I think, to a pterodactyl. They're incredible.
True. Yeah, that was an amazing shot. Yeah, your reel did such a good job. Your reel that went really viral did such a good job of capturing the feeling of that moment. Seeing that reel, as soon as it popped up, I was like, oh man, that is a cool moment. And it felt like I was there kind of witnessing that moment. So I loved that, how you captured that and just put that story, that simple short story was one of the most impactful or inspiring short stories I've ever kind of maybe come across. So it was really good.
Yeah, well, you know what's kind of funny is like I never really planned making a reel or anything about it. I think I was just so focused on pulling off the photo because it was such a ridiculous photo concept in the first place that like all my energy was just put into doing everything I possibly could to maximize my chance of getting the shot. Like we had backup plans, hours in every direction in the case we needed to move for like cloud cover reasons or if the birds weren't doing what we thought they'd be doing. So we had so many backup options. So all the resources I was spending like up and leading up to this was like just planning the photo itself. And then after I got the shot, like the first thing I did was go back to the Airbnb and like offload everything, back up everything. And then I'm looking at the photos and I was thinking like, maybe I should make a reel.
Yeah.
Because the reason I thought that is because I like opened up my phone after like, you know, this incredible experience. And obviously social media is already full of like everyone's eclipse photos and stuff, even though it's only been like minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, there's a lot of attention on this right now. Maybe I should make a reel. I had flown up a friend of mine from Vancouver to help film some stuff and help assist on the shoot. So we had some like extra content of like me photographing in the moment and that sort of thing. So I was like, okay, let's put together a reel. That evening we put out a reel, and then I think like I put it up like kind of a bit before I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning and it already had like millions of views.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That was wild.
Yeah, that was incredible. Yeah. I loved seeing your image though too, because your image was so unique as opposed to really any other eclipse image that I saw. So fantastic job.
Thank you.
What was it like? I was trying to imagine also watching that reel, like the boat's rocking back and forth and you're shooting like straight up into the sky. And I already know that like when I'm not on a boat, shooting straight up into the sky is already really annoying and difficult, you know, and all that stuff. How did you kind of like pull off that framing with that boat rocking and you're shooting straight up and all of that?
Yeah, so fortunately, because I live in a coastal area with a lot of coastal wildlife here in Vancouver, Canada, I do have a lot of practice over the years of photographing from boats. I do think obviously it's always going to be more challenging photographing from boats because you kind of have to turn your body into like some kind of stabilizer and counteract the motion of the boat a little bit. So it's always going to be more challenging, but it's the type of thing that you definitely, the more you do it, the more practice you get and the better you're going to be at it. So fortunately, just from years of experience of doing it here in British Columbia, I've gotten very used to photographing from boats. So I definitely had an edge there. But that doesn't mean it was going to be easy. We did also do a practice run a couple days before the eclipse, going out to the exact area we were hoping to photograph the eclipse and testing out, tracking the birds and all that sort of stuff. So that was kind of giving me a feel for what it would be like pointing straight up during the eclipse as well. So it was all, I guess, about like the practice and preparation. But when there's the movement of the boat and you're photographing a moving subject in low light, there's a lot of things working against you. And kind of whenever the odds are low, I always feel like as a photographer, one of the best things we can do to respond to that is by just taking lots of pictures. Because if you need to take 100 pictures to get one good one, then you got to take 100 pictures quickly, especially when you have just like a few minutes to pull it off, like in this case. So I definitely was taking a lot of pictures. I had been practicing during the practice run on the boat, like tracking birds coming in towards the sun, and like just getting a feel for that. Trying out different autofocus settings and all that sort of thing to kind of figure out what I was going to do. So when the time of Totality arrived, I felt like I had it down pretty well. I'd practiced. I knew exactly what settings I was going to use. So it all kind of came together quite nicely. But definitely the rocking of the boat was something that made it harder. And it was a bit of a trade-off actually here, because I was thinking about this in the lead up to the eclipse, like in the days leading up to it, of like, you know, how much the boat is moving. The windier it is, the more the boat's going to move, because there tends to be more chop on the water when it's windy. But if there's no wind, I also was thinking that it would hurt the chances of getting the photo, because with a lot of these seabirds, they spend a lot more time kind of soaring when there's wind. And when there's wind and it's blowing into like the cliffs on the islands, you get this like updraft. So often you get lots of like frigate birds soaring along the edge of the cliff really, really slowly when there is a wind, because they're just like facing into that wind and riding that like updraft, and they're just kind of staying in position. So like really, really nice opportunities for photography because they're not moving very fast. And there's lots of them. So I was thinking leading up to the eclipse, there's a sweet spot here of like enough wind to have a bunch of airborne frigate birds, but also not too much wind so that the boat's like shaking like crazy.
Yeah, that's so interesting, man. Yeah, you really thought through every single detail with it.
Yeah, it was absolutely necessary. The planning was just so important.
Yeah. So yeah, you had mentioned that it took you about a year and a half from vision to execution of this image. What was that? Can you kind of walk me through that process of planning a shot like this, and maybe what gave you the inspiration in the first place?
Yeah. So as far as inspiration goes, I've always been really passionate about birds and bird photography, but I'm also very passionate about space and astrophotography. It's kind of like my two core areas, I guess, where I often dedicate a lot of time. And that interest in astrophotography definitely came a little bit after my beginnings in bird photography. I had a science teacher in high school, grade 8 or 9, Mr. Prosick, who did an astronomy unit, which was actually like an optional unit. Like he didn't have to teach that one, but he chose to teach that one. And at that point, I'd already been photographing birds for a while, but it was after that unit, which I just found super inspiring, that I started to get into like photographing the night sky. And Mr. Prosick was an incredible teacher. I was very lucky to get him because he retired the next year, and he actually received the Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence, which is like one of the highest honors a teacher can get in Canada.
Wow.
So phenomenal teacher that I kind of credit towards starting just that unit, just is kind of where I started photographing the night sky. So over the years, I've always kind of looked for opportunities to combine like nature photography with astrophotography, and like, but it's like exceptionally difficult because all the things that birds do, like hide during the night for most species and move around, is just not very easy to photograph within the context of like a night sky. But I've always looked for opportunities to kind of combine those two sides of my photography. And I don't really know what kind of like sparked the specific idea of the eclipse, but it was probably just like looking at eclipse photos over the years. I'd seen photos of like people in front of the eclipse, and I probably was like, well, what would it take to get like a wild animal, like a bird or something, in front of an eclipse? Because obviously that's going to be more difficult because you can't tell a bird where to go, whereas you can tell a person where to stand. So that's kind of how I probably set down the path of this photo. And then in terms of planning it, when I started planning it, I was kind of looking at the upcoming eclipses. There's usually more solar eclipses than there are total solar eclipses. So it had to be a total solar eclipse where the moon completely blocks the sun. Otherwise, to be honest, it's not that impressive an event and very hard to photograph. And so there were a couple upcoming eclipses. There was one in Australia, and then there was this next one in Mexico. Well, Mexico all the way across the United States to Canada. But the reason I picked this one and ended up in Mexico was there was a few reasons. One, long duration of totality. So the Australian eclipse that was coming up next when I started planning this was a very short, I can't remember what it was, or maybe like a minute and a half or something of totality, which is actually pretty normal, but a lot shorter than the 4 minutes and 20 seconds that I had in Mexico this time. And also, I really wanted to take time to plan and find a spot that would have a lot of birds. So I was looking at the path of totality for this eclipse, was stretched from basically the Pacific Ocean over to Mexico, across the United States, and ending in Atlantic Canada. And just from my background with birds, coastal areas tend to have the most reliable, like big numbers and flocks of birds, which kind of narrows it down right away to Mexico, the coast of Mexico, and maybe some of those islands offshore, and like Atlantic Canada, like Newfoundland or New Brunswick. But then when you look at like historical weather, it's usually cloudy up in Atlantic Canada in April, where it's usually clear in Mexico in April. So that very quickly kind of got me to, okay, I'm going to go to Mexico. So I booked accommodation like a year in advance. I booked flights 11 months in advance. And kind of just scoured internet resources, trip reports, blog posts, eBird, Google Earth, Google Street View, everything I could to kind of try to identify spots that might have a lot of seabirds in the path of totality on the Mexican coast. And I actually, like probably a year before I even was in Mexico, ended up on the Piedras Blancas, these small islets off the coast of Mazatlan, as probably what was going to be the best choice. I still planned a bunch of backup options, but it did end up being those islands, the Piedras Blancas, that ended up being the place where I photographed the eclipse.
Man, that is just incredible. Yeah, the amount of planning that went into a shot like that is just phenomenal. And I mean, it shows so much, but I think it's like, I don't know, like, you know, there's a lot of times that you might hear pushback against like, oh, just like in, I guess just like leaning into purely enjoying the day and just taking whatever comes that day. And while there could be value to that too, and definitely on a level of enjoyment, it's like, it just like the results of your photo here and hearing how much planning you put into it really shows just how powerful that can truly be. So yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing all that. Is there any regrets or changes you would have made in that limited time you had photographing the eclipse?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say we were so well prepared. We were not over prepared. We were like as prepared as we needed to be, but we weren't under prepared. So I don't know that I would have changed anything really with the plan. I think everything was planned the best it possibly could have been. It is kind of funny is the photo that was my favorite and the one that kind of blew up is of the frigate bird in front of, it's not just in front of the total solar eclipse, but it's in front of this phase of the eclipse called the diamond ring, which is like a 10-15 second moment when like a tiny fraction of the edge of the sun is visible behind the moon, but it lasts like seconds. So it's very hard to like plan for that specific moment. For that specific moment, you do kind of just need to get lucky, and you make your own luck by being in the right place. But like, you can't plan for that. So when I was photographing the eclipse with the telephoto lens, I was at ISO 10,000, f7.1, and I had my shutter speed at 1/640th. And that was a pretty good exposure for photographing birds in flight. They're slow moving birds, so like it's possible at a 6/40th, at least when there's a bit of wind, to get them sharp. But not every frame was going to be sharp, so it was a bit of a trade-off between like I guess ISO and shutter speed. Yeah. But the second the diamond ring appears and that edge of the sun becomes visible, it actually gets way, way brighter instantly. So when I was looking through my viewfinder and the diamond ring appeared, which I knew it would because I had like a live countdown going that was like counting down to the diamond ring, the scene instantly gets brighter, but you have like 2 seconds to respond to that in terms of your camera settings. Otherwise you won't be able to get a shot of it. So I saw it get brighter, and I have my dial next to my shutter on the Canon R5 program to shutter speed. So I just quickly shot up that shutter speed from 1/640th to 1/4000th of a second. So the image of the frigate bird with the diamond ring is at 1/4000th of a second and ISO 10,000. Now, if I'd really, really anticipated exactly what would have happened at that moment, I probably should have, instead of ratcheting up my shutter speed, I probably should have shot down my ISO instead, and I probably would have had a less noisy resulting image. But ultimately, I just don't think in that 2 seconds that you have to respond, there's enough time to like make that sort of decision. And ultimately I did manage to shift the exposure settings to what they needed to be to not blow out that shot with the diamond ring with just a few seconds of time to do it. So I don't really regret that decision. It's just something that I've thought of that like, if I'd been like, I could have changed, I could have shot this with a lower ISO and didn't need such a fast shutter speed, and I could have gotten a less noisy image. But ultimately, because it's so just like shapes, like the noise doesn't really matter, and a little bit of denoising just works really, really well on that sort of photo because there's nothing complex going on. It's just like the outline of the frigate bird and the outline of the eclipse.
Yeah, it probably could have been like you adjust the shutter speed a little bit up, take the ISO a little bit down, but then that would have taken you an extra 2 seconds to do when you only have those 10-15 seconds. So I get that.
So I wouldn't have gotten the shot.
No, that was a perfect moment. I love that you chose a photo to share that had that diamond ring in it, because I agree that diamond ring sold that image a lot. So I love it. Yeah, since kind of discovering you, I've seen a lot of your past work since, and kind of looked into a lot of that, and have found myself very impressed with how you capture wildlife scenes in kind of unique and artistic ways. What are you kind of looking for when you're looking to capture a wildlife image?
That's a really good question. I think I generally describe my approach as like trying to capture birds and wildlife in a way that they're not often captured. I do obviously take a lot of just like standard portraits of birds and wildlife, but I always find the images that are more impactful are the ones that have a little bit of something extra. That little bit of something extra could be like something dramatic going on with the lighting. It could be something kind of unique going on with the composition. It could be something dramatic going on with like the behavior. Maybe it's like a rare behavior, or ideally it's like a combination of all those things. But one thing that I think that I often try to implement in my work that I consider to be, I guess, like my personal favorite work is I want there to be something about that image that is unique to the time and place that I captured that image. That would be very, very hard to recreate.
Interesting.
So when you're kind of photographing a close-up of an animal with like a completely blurred out background, I feel like, yes, those images are really, really beautiful and they can be very powerful in like conveying the emotion of an animal. But I also tend to feel like those are very easy to recreate if you can just find that animal and have the right gear to photograph it. Whereas if you have a photo that kind of captures a unique moment in time or in habitat, like showcasing some of that environment or showcasing a spectacular moment of behavior or light or whatever it is a much more unique photo to one time and place that is a lot harder to recreate. And I think that naturally those sorts of photos are going to have a much bigger impact on the viewer.
Yeah, I love that. I don't think I've ever really heard that perspective, but that is something that I really like, and I'm definitely going to be digesting myself and taking to heart. So yeah, that's good. Yeah, you've captured a couple images that specifically stand out to me. So I kind of want to just kind of rapid fire through a few, and you can kind of maybe explain some of your inspiration or how you captured each of them. I guess first to start, you were mentioning how you like astrophotography as well as bird photography. One of your images that I found really fascinating was your great horned owl image with what seemed to be stars behind it, and you got all the different colors. You got a little bit of red, orange, blue, right? How did you pull off capturing that image?
Yeah, so you're right. Those are stars behind the great horned owl there, kind of like an out of focus Milky Way. And one cool thing with the night skies, the stars all have color, but when you're when you're perfectly focused on them, they kind of just look like points of light, and it's hard to see the color. But if you put them out of focus, you actually see that color a lot better. So that's a really great observation that you made. I'm glad to hear that was noticeable. So yeah, that was a great horned owl in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. I'd gone out and photographed kind of the night sky many times in that area, and almost always I would hear great horned owls calling in the desert. But I'd never really made an effort to like try to track one down and photograph it. But that was in the fall of 2023 when I captured that photo. I was like, I knew I was heading to that area again. I was thinking like, okay, this year that's going to be my goal. Like, instead of just photographing the night sky, I'm going to try to track down some of these calling great horned owls. And it actually ended up being not as hard as I thought it would be. Like, just kind of follow where they're calling and you find them. Who would have thought? I mean, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, so I specifically had rented a lens for that. So I shot on the Sigma 105mm f1.4 because obviously I need as much light as possible. But also I didn't want to be shooting this at like a 300 2.8 because the idea was to get like an owl like with the stars and not like a close-up of an owl. So I shot it at I think I used like f1.6 or 1.8 was the setting that I used, just to have a little bit more detail in the stars. That was shot on a tripod. I think it was like a 4-second shutter speed. So really allowing a lot of light. And maybe ISO probably around like 10,000 or so for that one as well. And it's completely natural light. So there's like a little bit of side light coming on the great horned owl there, and that's actually from like a crescent moon rising on the horizon. So just adding like a little bit of side light to the bird, and it came out really well. Honestly, obviously it wasn't an easy photo to capture, but it was another one that I'd kind of planned out, and it ended up being easier to get than I expected. And I mean, I don't know, it was just a photo to me that really was one that made sense to go for, because like I've seen great horned owls at night before. You see the night sky, like you got to try to capture those two things in one image.
Yeah, it was incredible. I've seen great horned owl images with the moon in them, but never with stars in them. And in general, I don't know if I've ever seen a bird photography image with the stars in it that was not composited, you know? So, man, that was awesome. And I'm surprised that you were able to get it. I guess I would have even expected, like, in my brain, a little bit more of that star trail type of look, but that makes sense. If you're at 1.4, 10,000, yeah, you're probably, I guess, yeah, it makes sense that you're able to get it without any star trails at 4-second exposure. And but it was good. So I really enjoyed that image.
Thank you. I'm glad.
What about, so You were also the youth winner of the 2018 Audubon Photography Awards. And unknowingly to me at the time, I didn't know who you were at that time, but I had seen that image. And then years later now, kind of discovering more about you and seeing your Eclipse image and all that. But I had seen that image way back when in an Audubon magazine. And it's a fantastic image as well. For that win, you captured the behavior of a bunch of cobalt-winged parakeets gathering around a clay lick. What was kind of the thought process behind that capture and choosing to go slow exposure with, with the parakeets, and why specifically that shutter speed?
Yeah, so for that parakeet shot, that was in Yasuni National Park in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And cobalt-winged parakeets are birds that, when they fly, they have beautiful cobalt blue wings, as their name would suggest. Yeah. But it's something that, like, I find when they're just kind of like streaking around and flying through the forest, you really see that flash of blue. And I definitely felt that the slow shutter speed approach, which I had seen in photos from like clay licks before, was definitely the best way to kind of capture the color in their wings. That bird specifically, because of how much that blue kind of stood out when they were flying with a slow shutter speed. It's definitely the traditional approach with birds in flight, obviously, to use a fast shutter speed, because I mean that is what provides the highest rate of success. And whenever you're kind of taking that risk and going with a slow shutter speed, you're sacrificing most of your photos because most of them are not going to look that great.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a risk, but I tend to be pretty inclined when it comes to like setting camera settings to like go with the riskier settings with the chance of it being a much more interesting photo and just being willing to maybe not get anything good. So I just basically, as these parakeets are coming into the clay lake, which it was the third day of waiting at that clay lake for hours before they actually came down. Wow. When they came down, I'd had so much time to think through everything and think through all my settings because I'd been there for like 3 days.
Yeah.
That I kind of already, I guess, had my settings dialed in, and I was just like waiting for the moment. So I actually just I had a cable release. I just put in the settings, set the cable release on, and just had it continuously take photos through the entire time they were visiting the clay lake. So I think in that, I can't remember how long it was, maybe that like 10-minute period or whatever, I took like several thousand photos, just like continuously going through the photos. And a lot of people, I think they say like, oh, like, why do you need so many pictures? Like, clearly you've gotten the shot already. And like, I don't necessarily believe that, especially with cases like this. Like, there's so much going on that every single moment is completely different. And when I went through those like 3,000 pictures or whatever of the parakeets coming down to the clay lake, there were like 3 images that to me like were the clear standouts and way better than everything else, just because the birds happen to be in a good position, which again is luck, but also like in wildlife photography, you make your own luck by like being in the right place at the right time and having the right camera settings. So there were just these couple 2-3 images that to me were clearly better than all the others, and that wouldn't have been the case if I hadn't just spammed thousands of photos the entire time the parakeets were raining down. And especially important when you're taking a risk with your camera settings. I think those photos were at like maybe like a 1/13 of a second shutter speed.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, because I think that there's a lot of there can be a misconception sometimes that like a lot of those best images that you've seen are like pros that walk in, they take one shot and then they're gone, but it's so cool to hear for you even that you're taking, like you said, thousands of shots in a moment like that to pick just that perfect moment. And so, yeah, that's really awesome. So that's not the only Audubon time you've won. You also won the whole competition in 2023 with your image of the rock pigeon. What was interesting to me about that is that, like, I mean, rock pigeons are, probably the most common thing you get across the United States and probably a lot of parts. But yet it still was the image that took first place, and it's a fantastic image. What do you think it is about a common animal like that gets you that win in a competition as prestigious as that?
Yeah, I think actually part of it was that it's such a common animal, and because they're so common, they don't get a lot of photographic attention. And to me, I was really excited when I found out that this one was going to win, like specifically this shot, because to me it really represents something that I really, really believe in the field of wildlife photography, which is that you don't need to like be going off to like far off locations that are notorious for on the international level for like wildlife photography. Like you don't need to go on an African safari. You don't need to go to the Ecuadorian Amazon to get really interesting photos, because rock pigeons are a bird that for like most people in the world, they can just go for a walk in the city and find a rock pigeon because they've kind of been introduced everywhere. So I was really excited about that. But the same way, like I kind of approach any photography scenario, like I'm always looking for a way to photograph something in a unique way, no matter how familiar it is. And with this specific shot, it's kind of two rock pigeons with like their nice neck iridescence, that like turquoise and purple kind of gleaming. And the background is like black. So it's like almost a studio-like looking background, and they're allopreening, so they're preening each other. So you've got kind of that component of interesting lighting and interesting behavior. But of course it was deliberate. Basically these two rock pigeons I saw them preening each other on this post. And from where I was standing, the background was just like this light water, just like the clouds being reflected off of the water. But I was standing on a pier, a wooden pier, and the pier is obviously casting like a really dark shadow underneath it. So I just repositioned myself. So I was photographing those pigeons with that like dark shadow of the pier behind them. And because cameras don't perceive the world the same way our eyes do, the background through the camera, when you're exposed for like the bright light on the pigeons, just becomes like completely black. And I just kind of took a bunch of shots as they preened each other, and I thought that they stood out. Obviously, I think a lot of people wouldn't bother photographing something like a rock pigeon just because of how common they are. But like to me, because they are so common, you have so many opportunities to work with them. They have like little to no fear of people, which just means that the floodgates of photographic creativity get thrown wide open, and you can do so much. So I think all it must have been was just like a bird that they didn't see a lot of photos of, because it's a pigeon and a lot of people photograph them, kind of presented in a unique way, representing the idea that like anyone can go take an interesting photo of a bird without needing, all these amazing resources to travel. I think that's probably kind of why it was selected, but I for those reasons too, I was pretty excited when I found out that it was that image that I entered of all of them that had been picked.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a good reminder to me as well. I mean, before we started this, recording this interview, we were even talking about, for me, it's, I said it was pretty dry, quote unquote, in terms of a lot of the iconic species around the areas that I live. Like I have to travel pretty far to get anything really iconic. And so it's such a good reminder, even for someone like me, like to just, do the best constantly with what I can in my local area. And so I love that. And I love your kind of vision and inspiration behind it. There was one other image that I wanted to talk about. You mentioned earlier when I asked you about, it was kind of about, what you're looking for when you're capturing a wildlife image. You mentioned trying to make it like not replicatable, if that's a word, but making it kind of unique and all of that. One image that I feel like really does so is an image you got of a black bear and the salmon under the water, and you got it kind of split screen with a salmon and a black bear, and just that relationship. I loved how you captured that relationship, and then with the scene and the fall colors, or at least the yellow in the trees, it was just gorgeous. It was a gorgeously put together scene, and I feel is one of those ones that is just like, how do you replicate that again? I'd love to hear maybe your process behind that and what it was like planning and capturing that shot.
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, that was one that I was pretty happy with when it came together, because it was another one that I'd kind of been planning a lot. And when I think one of the most powerful things you can do as a wildlife photographer is tell a story of like that ecosystem that you're photographing. And for me, a very prominent, I guess, ecological story that's at the forefront of my life living here on the coast of British Columbia is the annual return of the salmon to spawn in the streams every single year.
Yep.
And I think there's like a background almost of the biology of this ecosystem that is really, really nice to have as a wildlife photographer. Like I did study biology in university, and I think that background kind of helps you both like plan and predict wildlife scenes and behavior, but it also like informs your approach of storytelling. Because when you learn the story of the Pacific salmon, for those that aren't like familiar with them, they are born in freshwater rivers. They go live their life out in the ocean. And when they're in the ocean, they feed a whole multitude of animals, everything from like killer whales to seals to like birds and stuff out in the ocean. So all sorts of things eat them in the ocean. Then at the end of their life, they return, the vast majority of them, to the very exact streams that they were born, which is absolutely incredible that they find their way from the vast ocean. There's thousands and thousands of streams on the coast, but they find their way to the same streams that they were born, and they head upstream against the current, and they spawn, and they give life to the next generation. And for most species of Pacific salmon, it costs them their life. They die after that process. And when they return to the rivers, it is a incredible wildlife feast. It is one of the most spectacular kind of wildlife phenomenons I've ever observed. You can have thousands of eagles, thousands of other birds. You have like American dippers grabbing their eggs, and you of course have the big charismatic megafauna. Depending where you are on the coast of BC, you can have grizzly bears, black bears, or wolves fishing for salmon. And all those animals fishing for salmon in the rivers also play a really significant ecological role, because they catch salmon in the rivers and then they go eat them in the forest. And when they eat them in the forest, often if you're a bear and you've fed well, they're very picky eaters. So they'll like just eat the eggs of the salmon when they're being picky. So that leaves a bunch of salmon carcasses in the forest that decompose into the forest. And that decomposition of the salmon in the forest fertilizes the growth of the forest itself. And the forests around salmon-bearing streams on the British Columbia coast grow so much faster and bigger than forests elsewhere. So there is this incredible connection that goes from salmon to bear to the forest itself. And I kind of wanted to capture this all in one picture. So that's kind of, I guess, how the idea started, is like, how do you tell this story of the ecosystem in one picture? So now it was time to start scouting and like finding the place that it was going to happen. So obviously I needed a stream with a nice forest around it that was full of salmon that also had bears, which is actually not that difficult to find in parts of the coast here, because we have a lot of streams with salmon and bears. But what is difficult to find is the perfect place in the stream to attempt a photo like this. Obviously there's a lot more salmon than there are bears. So my first thing was I wanted to find a spot in the stream that just had a continuous flow of salmon going by, such that like any single moment there would always be salmon there. Because if there was always a salmon there, then when a bear walked past, there'd probably be a salmon in the shot. But if I was photographing in a spot where like there were only occasionally salmon, the chances of a bear and a salmon coinciding at the same time would be very, very minimal. So I needed to find a spot in the stream that had a lot of salmon. I needed that place also needed to be a spot with like calm enough water and shallow enough water, such that there was like lots of light coming into the water and there wasn't a lot of silt. And also the calm water is important to give like a nice neat division in the photo between above the water and below the water. If the water is really fast, you just get like a big mess and you don't have like a clean line. So it took like a few days to find the right stream and the right spot on the right stream where that condition kind of was met. And then it also had to be along some kind of path. There had to be some kind of bit of land or something in the frame that bears would often frequent. So after like a few days, obviously I've been photographing this coast for years, so like there's the background knowledge of like where to look that I already kind of had from just years of photographing here. But it took like a few days of just out looking on the stream for the perfect spot to put a camera before I found that perfect spot. So then I got camera in position. It's actually harder than you would think to perfectly line up a camera where like you have a nice clean division between above and below water. Like it has to be very, very precise. So what I did is I have an underwater housing for my Canon R5. I had a 14mm lens on there in an Aquatech underwater housing with like an 8-inch dome port, which is what helps you get that clean division between above and below the water. And I suspended it upside down from like an inverse center column of a tripod. So like I have the tripod legs, and then the center column's like hanging upside down with like the housing there. And I put it in position and I left it in the water. And because I don't have like really, really complex gear to like do a complex like remote triggering setup for a camera in a housing, because there isn't really room in the housing to like attach like a trigger, a wireless receiver or something, I actually just set up the camera to take a photo every single second. So I put the camera in the river, I had it take one photo every single second, and then I would have to go in every like 3 or 4 hours to like swap out a battery and memory card, and if the lighting had changed, maybe like change the settings. And this remote approach was critical because if I was standing there in the river, I just think the odds of a bear coming out would be heavily reduced. And also, I want to minimize my impact on that river system. If I'm sitting in a river, I could be disturbing salmon. I also could be disturbing the bears that are trying to fish for the salmon. So that kind of remote approach works really, really well here. So I just had the photo by having that camera in the river. And I was like maybe 100 yards away, just kind of sitting in the forest, and I would check on the camera every few hours. So I didn't even know until the very end of the day when I got back to my desk and I'd look at on the computer, like if I got anything. I wasn't checking in the middle of the day, and I wasn't constantly watching the river because I figured if I was standing there watching it, the bears might not come out.
Yeah.
So it ended up taking 3 days of that. And after 3 days, I got a shot where a bear came out and there was a salmon in perfect position at the same time. There were some other frames where I had like a bear and a salmon, but like the salmon was like partially cut off, or the bear was like really far, or I had one where the bear was like super, super close, but it was like right at dusk and it was just so dark and there weren't any salmon in the shot. But 3 days, I think something like in the tens of thousands of photos, because taking one photo every single second, so like in the low tens of thousands of photos, and then one frame where it all came together.
Wow. Man, it is just it's so crazy. Like I'm personally just like being inspired, but also like reevaluating how I do things, because like it's so I feel like it's most every wildlife photographer is just like, if I don't get the shot within, a few hours or a day, like it's so easy to just throw in the towel and be like, oh, let's move on to the next thing, right? And even for me, like I'm like, I'll try to give it like 2 or 3 days, and if I'm not getting it after 2 or 3 days of like 3 hours out each morning, a lot of times I'm like, it's just not meant to be, But it's so cool hearing you talk about things in the terms of like days, and then when it comes to month planning in the terms of like weeks, and it's just so refreshing to hear that and see how that impacts your photography, and it's very evident, so it's making me think a lot.
Yeah, well, in this case, I think one of the things that was driving me forward is that like every day when I looked at the pictures, there were like close calls. There was like, oh, the bear's there but the salmon's not there, or you have the edge of the salmon, the edge of the bear, like it was clearly possible. Yeah. So like if I had gone the first day and there'd been like absolutely nothing, like I may have been more inclined to just kind of abandon the idea, or maybe like want to try it somewhere else. But because like I could see that it could happen, there was this constant motivation of like, yes, I just need to do one more day. I actually extended my trip by a day because 2 days into that, a few days of scouting, a couple days camera in the water, I was gonna go home, but I was like, I'm so close. Yeah. So I extended one more day and then I got the shot.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you did that. Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah. So, I mean, kind of switching gears a little bit back to, you had some images that have won competitions. So clearly you've been involved in competitions. You enjoy them to a certain extent. What is it that you enjoy about wildlife photography competitions? And how do you think the community kind of benefits from having competitions like that?
I'm a big fan of wildlife photography competitions. And I know different photographers have different kind of perspectives on them. But for me, like from a very young age, from long before I was like had any recognition in any kind of contest of any kind, photo contests were just a really great source of inspiration. Obviously, photography is such a subjective, and art in general is like such a subjective thing. So I don't think anyone truly thinks that like the photo contests are the clear answer to what are the best photos ever taken, or what is the best photo taken this year. Like, because it's so subjective. So everyone's going to have like a different answer to that question. But I think it's pretty undeniable that whether you like all images that are awarded or not, they are often incredible collections of very interesting photos, and there is so much to learn from them and so much to be inspired. My goal with like any day that I'm thinking about photography, any day I'm working, whether it's out in the field or doing something like this, having a conversation with someone, or like looking at photo contest results, or working with like clients on some of the photo trips that I guide, I always just want to learn. Because the more you kind of take in and you learn, the better you become. And I just feel like you can learn so much about the artistry of photography by looking at the results of photo competitions. Whether or not you like the image, like there's so much to be learned. And then you can discover new photographers and go look at their portfolio and see what they do. So for me, photo contests are just an amazing source of inspiration to kind of give you ideas and techniques and just learn about wildlife photography.
Yeah, totally. I couldn't agree more. The competition that I host annually, one of the winners in this last year's competition inspired me, myself, who I'm hosting the competition, to go out and try to get an image that was similar stylistically to that.
Cool.
So, yeah, I totally agree with that. Do you think that winning or losing a competition changes your perspective of your own art with your own images?
Not really. Like, because like you obviously enter way more photos than are ever going to be awarded, and oftentimes nothing is awarded. So like I don't think you can't let like not winning a photo contest affect the way you think of your own art. I also think that winning a photo contest should never be like the goal of the art, because like I don't think you should necessarily give the full control of whether or not you're a success as a photographer into someone else's hands of deciding whether it wins the photo contest. I think that's silly. Like you should be able to kind of enjoy your own work and come to your own conclusions about your own work. So I do not think that like success in photo competitions should be taken at all seriously as a way to like judge your own work. I do though think that sometimes like if a photo that I took is awarded in a competition, it might change my perspective on that specific photo and make me think more about
more of it,
like what caught people's eye. Like we were chatting earlier about the pigeons. Like I didn't think that hard leading up to the contest about this idea of like, well, I thought about it a little bit, but I hadn't gone as in-depth into like, oh, the pigeons represent a bird that's accessible in the cities and all that stuff. To me, it was like, well, it makes sense to photograph pigeons because you can do really cool things with them. But I think that like it makes you think more about why that photo connects to people if it's awarded. But if you don't win, I don't think it matters at all. Like you should not judge your work based on how successful you are in photo contests.
Yeah, I love that. That was very well said. Yeah, and I mean, when you think about statistically, the chances of you placing at all are so low. So it's hopefully people never feel too, the goal is to never make people feel too discouraged and rather encouraged by the results. And that's something that like with the competition I host, the reason why we do it live and we're the only competition in the world that does it live, all the judging live, is because I like to use it as like a source of like not only where you submit your images and then you kind of just find out a few months later, did this win or did it not? And it's a few select images, but I like to like go through the images and show this is what the judges are thinking as they're looking at this. This is what you can learn from it as a viewer, as an audience member. This is why it's being kind of like admired. And so, I love the learning aspect of competitions a lot, like you mentioned.
Totally.
So love what you shared.
That's really good. I like that. That's a great idea to do it live. Yeah, you're right. The one thing that's lacking in most photo competitions is feedback. So
yeah, I do also after the live judging, because we narrow down to the finalists. We do a live judging with all the finalist photos, which winds up being 10 in each category. And we'll judge those live on the spot with 5 judges. And then afterwards, I always wind up doing a recap. But it's getting to the point now, we're going into our third annual competition. But since it's growing each year, like last year, I did a 10-hour live stream reviewing every single photo that was submitted because I want to make sure everyone gets feedback on their photo, even if they didn't place. But it's getting to the point now where I'm like, oh man, I don't know how much longer I can do this. So gonna have to figure out for this year what we're doing.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, and that's true. Like, like a contest like Wildlife Photography of the Year that gets like 50,000+ entries, like this would just be impossible.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, your professional career seems as if it's been thriving for a while. I did notice though, after your Eclipse reel, your Instagram, for example, specifically really blew up and you gained thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of followers since. What's that experience been like for you with social media and kind of going viral, blowing up, positives, negatives?
I mean, it's been very cool. It was never like something I was like, it was never a part of the plan with that like reel that I posted for the Eclipse, like I was saying earlier. So it was kind of just like a nice surprise. And like my audience about doubled or so. So that's been very cool. I've always seen social media as like, it's interesting. Like it's a mix of like, from like making a career out of photography and like photography as a business perspective. Social media is really important because it showcases your work to people. It's like the best way to like have your work being seen by people. And it like it brings people to your offerings, your tours, your workshops, your prints that are for sale, whatever it is, your services as like an assignment photographer. So it's like a good way to like connect to a lot of people. So in that sense, having some kind of audience on social media, I think is really important. But I also think that like having a big social media audience isn't necessary for like being a professional wildlife photographer. Like there's plenty of professional bird photographers, even bird photographers who like make their career selling workshops that like don't have a lot of followers on social media. So, and there's plenty of like really successful, like especially older generation photographers who like don't have social media at all, who are professional photographers. So while I don't think it is necessary at all to have like a social media audience to be a professional photographer, from like a business perspective, it does simply make sense because it's a really good way to like reach your audience and reach new audience. I have to say, I have always been a little bit skeptical of like reels from the perspective of like, I know reels get a lot of engagement and I know that they convert to a lot of followers more than like posts or anything like that, just because I guess of how the algorithm works. But I have been skeptical of like, are the people who are watching reels people who are like clients from like a business perspective?
Yeah.
And is there a potential harm to like diluting your pool of like really interested clients by like having a bunch of people who saw you on their screen for 10 seconds and then decided to follow you? I don't really know the answer. Like I would have said like, I don't know that like helps from a photography business perspective that much. However, after this experience, I do have like a slightly different perspective on it, specifically as it relates to like selling photography, and like making a living from like selling art. I don't think there'll be much of a conversion from like real viewers to like people who are coming out on like workshops and tours. But like there definitely is a conversion from like real viewers to like people who are interested in your art. I will add that like from a storytelling perspective, like as wildlife photographers, we have a very unique position where we are photographing nature, we're benefiting a lot from nature, and obviously nature and wildlife is not in the best place that it could be, right? There's a lot of major conservation issues in a world that is changing very, very rapidly. So I do think that that is a critical thing and like almost responsibility that we have as wildlife photographers, from the perspective of that, like if we have an audience, by sharing photos of nature that was taken like respectfully, we have the ability to really like educate people and bring nature to people who might not necessarily be so fortunate as I am to like be out in nature all the time and experience wildlife. So there's almost this like science communication bridge that we can take by like showing visuals of wildlife, and that can make people care more about them and want to protect them. So from that perspective, the bigger your audience, the better. And I think that is a huge incentive to like have a large audience, is you have this ability to kind of do good with your photography and tell stories that need to be told.
Yeah, that's really good. I feel like you've talked about, a lot of the upsides to it, whether that be business, conservation, and those are all really good things. Do you think that there's any downsides to how social media kind of has become popular in something like wildlife photography? Yeah, there's plenty of downsides. I personally think that the upsides probably outweigh the downsides, but there are definitely negatives to wildlife photography on social media. From a like art perspective, there's a couple things. One, I feel like the mobile view of wildlife photography, like in a phone screen, very much impacts the way people photograph wildlife, because your screen's small, so people want to capture a close-up shot so it fills the screen more than they want to capture like a beautiful environmental shot. So like the type of photo that you would want blown up big on your wall in person is not necessarily the same type of photo that like does well on social media or looks good on a phone. And also there's even things like, I think like a lot of photographers, as social media became more popular, started changing their compositions to be more vertical to fit a phone screen. And like, I'm guilty of this. Like I often crop pictures to be vertical before I post them on social media. And like, on one hand, I guess that's just like adapting to the medium that people are consuming your work. So like on that sense, I guess it's not really that big of a problem, because that's just like how people are viewing your work. And if that's where people are coming from, then may as well adapt to it. But on the other hand, like I still do feel like
photos at their best are like big, like blown up, like a big print or something. And I feel like the tendency to photograph for a phone screen can like taint the artistry of like a beautiful big print. So there's that side of things. But I'm also thinking of like just like unethical wildlife tourism, like people like posting selfies with like captive cats, like tigers or like elephants or like stuff like that, where like if it weren't for social media, there'd be a much smaller incentive, I think, for like people to be like seeking out kind of like experiences that are not good for animals. So there's that negative for sure, and how it affects how humans interact with the natural world. But I also think that there's this huge positive that I was talking about of like, well, it also gives people an opportunity to learn and connect to nature in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. So there's always going to be positives and negatives, and there's always going to be both. But I think it is a really important conversation to have. So I appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, that's really good. I love that you shared that. And those are some really important things to keep in mind, especially in regards to a lot of the motivations and reasons why we are using social media and all of that stuff. So that's really good. So if you had to pick one place in the world to photograph wildlife, that's your absolute favorite that you've, done, and you've maybe done it a couple times or maybe only once, where would it be? And what does that kind of look like for you?
I personally feel super, super lucky to live where I do on the coast of British Columbia. And I always say, like, even though I've had lots of very cool opportunities to travel for wildlife photography to all sorts of places, I always love coming back here. So my answer to what's my favorite place in the world for wildlife photography is home. We have some amazing photography opportunities here. We were chatting before we started recording, but one of the things I love about this area is that, first of all, we have such this diversity of environment. So we've got the ocean and all that coastal ecosystems, but we also have the mountains that come right down to the ocean. So you can be up in the mountains in the morning and you can be in the ocean in the afternoon. And also just this incredible rich, it's not just that scenery, but it's like rich wildlife opportunities all year round. If I had to pick like one season that is my favorite, it would probably be kind of the September salmon run. That, like we were talking about earlier, that big influx of salmon into the streams in coastal British Columbia just brings a huge concentration of wildlife of all types to the area. But I fully credit like how I got into this career and this passion to the place where I live. It was just the access to nature and the amazing birds especially, but all sorts of wildlife that just exist not that far from my home city of Vancouver, in some cases even in my home city of Vancouver. So my favorite place on earth, it's home. It's coast of British Columbia.
I love it. That's awesome. That is really cool. So if you had to pick one thing, this is the question I ask everyone that I interview, what is the single most important thing to remember in wildlife photography?
Ooh, that is a really, really good one. I would say, it's hard to pick just one thing, but I would say from a purely photographic perspective, the most important thing about wildlife photography is the time that you put into it. So the best wildlife photos are few and far between. So if you want to maximize your chance of getting that best wildlife photo, you need to be taking thousands and thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands, dare even say millions of photos to get those best shots. And you need to be putting in that time investment in the field to get that done, right? Especially with wildlife, interesting encounters can be few and far between. So you need to spend time just to have those encounters. And then when you have those encounters, you may or may not get a good photo from that encounter. Also, most encounters aren't going to have some kind of crazy thing going on with behavior or lighting or composition or whatever. So you really need to have this time investment, I think, and you need to be really passionate about it. In order to get the best photos possible. And that goes into the preparation, the planning, the field time where you're actually out taking the pictures, and then also, in my opinion, the time afterwards where you're thinking about, what am I going to do with these pictures? What stories can I tell with these pictures? How can I communicate the importance of this animal or this ecosystem to the world?
I love how thoroughly and how comprehensively you think about each of your photos, and it's really cool to see. So I appreciate it, and appreciate you being on here today. Thanks for sharing all that you did, and I can't wait to see what you keep continuing to come up with in terms of your art. So
Thanks so much, Jeremy. It's honestly an honor to be here with you, so thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to see more from Liron Gertsman, make sure to head over to his website in the description below. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can check out more interviews with wildlife photography creators on our podcast playlist on this channel. And make sure you subscribe to our Wilder leaflet in the description, a newsletter that gets you exclusive wildlife photography news, access, and gear discounts. See ya in the next episode.